Well everyone, Bungie caved. Stasis has turned in its 2 weeks notice. And let's be honest, it's only been in the game for 5 months, people haven't had the chance to adapt yet. I think we can all agree, these nerfs are extreme and a bit premature, but it's too late to have that conversation now, cards are on the table. Let's look at the specific changes. First note is that damage resistance has been completely removed from Shatter Dive, so immediately get started on the wrong foot with a random, arbitrary change. If Chaos Reach and Glacial Quake get damage resistance, why doesn't Shatter Dive? I can't help but see the obvious bias against Hunters there. Shatter Dive is also going to have a cooldown of 4 seconds going forward, which won't change anything since it's not like anyone was spamming this ability for movement and damage resistance anyway, but the principle of it does still bother me. Withering Blade is going from 90 damage to 65. This is a weird change since 2 normal melees is enough to kill, so you'd think 2 charged melees would absolutely be enough to kill, and yet they only do 180 damage, and soon it's going to be dropped to 130. If anything, you'd think this charged melee ability obviously needs a buff, but whatever. Taking into consideration that both charges will be only slightly better than the standard melee post-patch, I think it's pretty likely the meta will shift in favor of closing the gap and just punching them in the dome. Freeze stacks have also been reduced from 60 to 40, which means 2 Withering Blades will no longer freeze, so it's essentially being reduced from a supernatural frosty throwing knife to something more like a snowball with a rock in it. And while we all know being hit by a rock is nothing to joke about,
You ever been hit with a rock? Don't joke about that.
I'm just not sure that 65 damage is enough for a long-range ricocheting, tracking, debuffing melee ability with 2 charges to be viable. On that note, the tracking range is being reduced from 12 to 8 meters, meaning that if the blade has to bounce before hitting a player, it won't lock on unless they're much closer to the point of impact than before. As a result, hunters who've spent the past few months refining their tactical prowess by throwing both knives around a corner and letting Jesus take the wheel, will have to begin the slow, difficult process of learning how to aim at players on the enemy team in order to defeat them. In addition to the obvious problem of this causing a rough transitional period, it also actively conflicts with the main appeal of playing Destiny, which is, of course, being told that you did a good job regardless of which buttons you chose to press. Behemoth Titans are getting some changes as well. Glacial Quake will no longer freeze nearby players upon activation, which destroys the Panic super utility. The defining characteristic of Glacial Quake has always been that you could turn a losing fight into a winning one instantly by just pressing Q, but without the activation freeze, the chance that you pop super and die instead of getting 8 or more kills skyrockets to about 2%. The super will also have a shorter duration due to how energy will be consumed. The cost of the light attack is currently 3% and is being increased to 7%. This cost is deducted when a Titan finishes the melee currently, so you can begin a light attack for movement and interrupt it with the freeze slam attack to only use the heavy attack's cost, but in the new patch, the cost of the melee will be applied in this case too. This change is aimed at reducing the overall mobility and length of the super to prevent Titans from spamming the melee. As a result, Glacial Quake will be usually lasting around 20 seconds down from the current base of 3 minutes. Additionally, damage resistance in Super is being reduced from 60% to 50%, which comes out to a 70% increase in damage received. This means that when using Glacial Quake, you'll have to acknowledge enemy players, which is a significant change from the current patch and could cause far-reaching consequences such as Behemoth Titans potentially even dying mid-super. Personally, if I were looking at changing those numbers, I would start with something more moderate, like 59% first, and see how that played out for a couple months before doing anything crazy. As far as balance is concerned, most players are familiar with the current meta's counterplay against Glacial Quake. So we'll need to wait for those players to adjust their fight or flight response before we begin collecting feedback in the post-patch sandbox. My instinct is that with these changes, you could be equally effective with a different class, which kind of defeats the point of Behemoth and frankly, undermines the $40 I spent on Beyond Light. Oh, and one more point about Behemoth Titans. When they hit a player with Shiver Strike, the player will be affected by a much sharper downward momentum, so that they don't just fly across the map like they currently do. I'm curious to see how that'll affect Shiver Strike in practice, but I'm skeptical it's the right direction to take the ability since it sounds substantially less funny. Warlock Stasis is also seeing changes. The super's tracking strength decays over 2.2 seconds currently, and that's being upped to 10 seconds. The concept of being mapped by a 5-second freeze ability sounded pretty terrifying at first, but then I remembered that a Stasis Warlock is simply not going to be able to close a gap in that time to shatter any Guardian Sickles. Additionally, the proximity detonation of the attack is being increased by 10%, and it decays to 40% of its initial size as it Jotuns its way across the galaxy. I think these changes safely take Winter's Wrath from its standing as only slightly better than Nova Warp to being decidedly better than Nova Warp, but still the second worst super in the game. The super feels bad because you don't get sprinting speed in it, let alone any other movement abilities other than floating. The blast attack can't be used rapidly, so it's relatively easy to punish. Its projectiles travel slowly enough to be able to escape, And when the blast does connect, you still have to follow up with a shatter, making it the only offensive super in the game to require at least 2 attacks to kill a standard HP Guardian. Seems like they wanted its niche to be getting to shut down other supers, but since other supers break out of ice quickly and have movement abilities, its niche is actually just getting shut down. The changes in these patch notes don't address any of the things that made the super feel bad in the first place. Sure, it'll be a bit more threatening, but just on account of how bad it feels as a super, I'll be surprised if we see it gain popularity from a buff that only improves aspects of it that were already in our control. It's kind of wild that Winter's Wrath and Glacial Quake exist in the same sandbox at all. Next up, we have another buff for our most underrepresented Stasis subclass. The Warlock melee, Penumbral Blast, is being improved from 80 impact damage to 30. Wait, what? The enemy already only gets frozen for like a second and doesn't have to break out, and gets damage resistance during that one frozen second. Is everything okay, Bungie? How is this change coming from the same studio that released the original version of this ability? Alright, well, what's next? Last Warlock specific bit. Looks like Ice Flare Bolts are getting some usability improvements. They are going to be able to lock onto targets from 33% farther away, be able to turn more sharply, which will probably translate into an overall farther reach in many cases, and they'll no longer continuously try to switch targets. I didn't notice that happening, but I guess that's a good thing. If this also affects Ice Flares from Cold Snap Grenades, it is pretty likely those are going to be the new meta. So that's the changes for the classes. I know you guys are all probably really frustrated to hear how they're gutting everyone's favorite kit in the game, but actually we're not quite done yet. There are still some general Stasis changes to talk about. Duskfield grenades are getting a big ol' slap on the face. The impulse of the pull as the grenade lands is having its radius effectively reduced from 9.5 to 6 meters, which is a huge change and effectively means that we'll see a lot of situations where the grenade harmlessly lands nearby and does nothing. The slow stacks applied by Duskfield are also going to be halved across the board. Detonation stacks are getting reduced from 20 to 10, and ticks inside the grenade are being reduced from 10 to 5. This means that in order to freeze an enemy player with a Duskfield grenade post-patch, you're going to want to ensure that their controller is disconnected before throwing a Duskfield grenade directly at center mass, and then immediately throw both your Withering Blades and dodge. Simple as that. Stasis crystals from Glacier grenades are also having their damage reduced from a maximum of 85 and a minimum of 55 damage to a maximum of 55 and a minimum of 25 damage. I haven't been very serious at all in this video, so I feel like I should clarify that those numbers aren't a joke, because as I'm looking at them, it kind of feels like one. They're actually dropping the Glacier grenade damage another big chunk. I feel like Glacier grenades weren't particularly oppressive after the first patch once I got used to it, but if these changes impact crystal damage as much as it looks like they're going to, I just can't see anyone bothering with them anymore in PvP. An interesting note about a lot of these changes is that they are applied strictly to use against other Guardians, which begs the question, if Stasis abilities were actually unfair in the current patch, don't you think Dregs would be complaining about them too? There's like a billion Dregs for every player. Classic case of listening to the vocal minority. And now to close this video out, it's time to say a few actual, genuine thoughts. Overall, a lot of these changes make Stasis far less obnoxious to play against. Most of the changes are needed, like what's happening to Behemoth Titan, but some of the changes actually do genuinely look like overkill to me, and I'll be interested to see if, for instance, Glacier grenades are still used in PvP at all. Glaciers are already useless on Warlocks since they have no way to shatter them, but now investing fragments for crystal shatter damage and grenade regeneration is going to be a pretty hard sell for Hunters and Titans too, with a max of 55 damage per crystal. I just don't see people using their fragments to make Glaciers usable, when they could instead use them to make Cold Snaps devastating with the damage buff fragment. My guess is that the meta will remain largely unchanged outside that though, since Titans can still grenade and then melee from a distance, and Hunters can still slow you and kill you with the same basic ability combinations as before, not to mention the fact that the Hunter super will be relatively stronger, with both Chaos Reach and Behemoth Titans getting significant nerfs. I feel like these changes are Bungie's way of sidestepping that breaking out of freezes has always taken too long and was never a practical solution to being frozen. I feel like they dug themselves into a hole making the breakout time so long because they balanced the Stasis supers around that expectation, and now it would require a lot of work to make a faster breakout and not ruin those supers. All said and done, these changes are a good move for playability in the Crucible, and it's great that PvE is not going to be hurt in the process. Nice work on that part, Bungie. If you enjoyed this video, drop it a like. If you at any point thought I was serious when I wasn't, congratulations. See you in the comments. Have a good day, everyone.